November 2nd, 1983. The world did not end, but the margin of error was thinner than the casing of a ballistic missile. In the command bunkers of the Warsaw Pact, a NATO exercise known as Able Archer 83 was being misinterpreted in real time as the cover for a genuine first strike. We often view the Cold War as a game of psychology, but had the order been given, psychology would have instantly yielded to physics. We are not here to discuss the politics of 1983. We are here to run the simulation that Soviet General Secretary Yuri Andropov feared. We will strip away the Hollywood fireballs and examine the systemic reality of a high-intensity nuclear exchange in Europe. We will analyse the grid physics, the supply chain mathematics, and the calorie depletion rates. This is not a story about ideology. It is a story about the failure of the invisible machines that keep you alive. To understand the catastrophe, we must first audit the assets. In 1983, the European theatre was the most militarised space in human history. But behind the tank divisions lay a civilian infrastructure that was already operating on a just-in-time basis, though they didn't call it that yet. The electrical grid of Western Europe was a synchronized machine, the UCTE, relying on the precise frequency balance of 50 Hz. A deviation of just a few Hz would cause physical damage to turbines. The food system was equally centralized. As noted in the 1982 National Academy of Sciences report on post-nuclear nutrition, urban centers held only days of food stocks, heavily dependent on diesel transport. The system was efficient, but efficiency is the enemy of redundancy. The Soviet target list wasn't just aiming for barracks, it was aiming for the nodes that connected these systems. Soviet nuclear doctrine distinguished between counter-force, hitting military targets, and counter-value, hitting cities. However, in the compact geography of West Germany, the Benelux countries, and the UK, this distinction is mathematically irrelevant. A 500 kiloton airburst over the port of Antwerp is a military strike against NATO logistics, but it is also a death sentence for the calories entering Northern Europe. A strike on the switching stations of the Ruhr Valley cripples the German war industry, but it also stops the pumps for the regional water supply. The simulation begins with a salvo of SS-20 Sabre intermediate-range ballistic missiles. Flight time, less than 15 minutes. The target set is not designed to kill populations specifically, but to dismantle the state's capacity to function. The result, however, is indistinguishable. The primary fragility of the 1983 grid lay in the extra-high voltage, EHV, substations. These are the hearts of the grid, stepping down 380,000 volts to usable transmission levels. They are vast, open-air fields of ceramic and copper. They are also exceedingly soft targets. You do not need a direct hit to destroy an EHV substation. An overpressure of just 5 psi, generated by a megaton-class weapon detonating 10 kilometers away, is sufficient to shatter ceramic insulators and rupture oil-filled transformers. Once these transformers burn, they cannot be replaced. Lead times for EHV transformers in 1983 were measured in months, sometimes years. If you destroy 50 specific nodes in Central Europe, you do not just cause a blackout. You effectively delete the electrical infrastructure of the continent. The simulation commences at 0600 Zulu, early morning in Central Europe. The detection window for NATO is roughly 6 to 8 minutes for the incoming intermediate-range missiles. In this time, protocols dictate the release of NATO's own tactical nuclear weapons to prevent them from being destroyed on the ground, the use it or lose it dilemma. This ensures that the exchange is bilateral. We are proceeding with the assumption of a limited strategic exchange, approximately 400 to 600 warheads detonated across the European theatre. This is considered a conservative estimate by 1980s standards. The first physics package arrives. Impact, hour 0. Before the blast waves even propagate, the grid dies at the speed of light. High-altitude detonations generate an electromagnetic pulse, EMP. The E1 component of the pulse induces thousands of volts per metre into long conductors. In 1983, the high-voltage transmission lines of Europe act as perfect antennas. This massive surge of current travels down the lines into the substations, frying the control relays and SCADA systems instantly. Simultaneously, the protection mechanisms, designed to trip breakers to save the equipment, are overwhelmed. We see immediate synchronous failure. It is not a flicker, it is a hard disconnect. The UCTE synchronous grid, stretching from Portugal to Poland, shatters into hundreds of unsynchronized electrical islands. Seconds later, the physical blast waves arrive. We must look at the specific targets. The USSR targets the energy military complex, the Rhine-Ruhr industrial belt, the refineries of Rotterdam, the command centres in High Wycombe. In these zones, the overpressure exceeds 20 psi. Large thermal power plants, coal and oil, are structural steel frameworks. They buckle and collapse. The turbine halls, spinning at 3000 RPM, disintegrate under the shock, turning into shrapnel. But the critical damage is systemic. When 40% of the generation capacity is physically removed from the grid in a millisecond, the remaining 60% cannot absorb the load imbalance. The frequency drops like a stone. Surviving generators in France or Spain, seeing the frequency drop below 47 Hz, automatically trip offline to protect themselves. This is the cascade. A common misconception is that nuclear power plants would keep the lights on. The opposite is true. In the first 5 minutes, every operating nuclear reactor in West Germany, France, and the UK initiates an emergency scram. The control rods drop, halting the fission reaction. However, a reactor in scram is not off. It is producing massive amounts of decay heat that must be actively removed by coolant pumps. These pumps require megawatts of electricity. With the external grid gone, the plants must switch to on-site emergency diesel generators. Suddenly, the icons of infinite energy become desperate consumers of diesel fuel. If those generators fail, or if the fuel runs out, we are looking at dozens of meltdown events within days. For the grid, nuclear power is no longer an asset. It is a liability demanding immediate triage. By minute 45, the split-up is complete. Central Europe is dark. Pockets of power might exist in the hydroelectric heavy regions of Switzerland or Norway, or isolated islands in Spain, but they are severed from the main grid. Crucially, the brain of the system is dead. The control centres that coordinate load balancing rely on telecommunications, microwave relays and landlines. These are either physically destroyed or powered down. Grid operators are blind. They cannot see which lines are live, which substations are burning, or where the load is needed. Even if a power plant survives, it cannot restart, black start, without a functioning grid to synchronise against, or instructions from a control centre. The grid is not just off, it is paralysed. Phase B, the information vacuum. It is now hour 2. The immediate blast effects have settled. Fires are raging in the target zones. But for the 200 million Europeans outside the immediate blast radii, the defining experience is silence. The civilian warning systems, like the UK's carrier-receiver network, relied on telephone lines and grid power to sound the sirens. In many areas, the sirens never sound. People are waking up to a dead phone line and a dark house. The batteries in the telephone exchanges are designed to last only a few hours. Once they drain, the localised communication that survives the EMP begins to fade. Rumour replaces data. Panic is the new currency. While the civilians panic, the logistics officers are staring at a mathematical impossibility. A modern economy is a flow, not a stock. to feed a city like London or Paris requires a precise, continuous inlet of thousands of trucks per day. The Soviet strike plan prioritized lines of communication, bridges, rail yards, and ports. The Rhine bridges are down. The rail hubs at Frankfurt and Lyon are vaporized. But even where the roads are intact, the flow stops. Why? The fuel pumps. Retail gas stations rely on electric pumps. Without grid power, the fuel underground is inaccessible. Within 6 hours, every truck on the road is running on the fuel in its tank. When that tank is empty, the truck becomes a static obstacle. The circulatory system of the continent is clotting. Let us zoom in on a critical node. A large metropolitan hospital in a non-targeted city, perhaps Munich or Milan. They have backup generators, but hospital generators in 1983 were designed for short-term outages, hours, not weeks. They are now powering life support, operating theatres for the incoming blast victims, and elevators. They are burning diesel at a rate of 200 litres per hour. Their tank holds 5,000 litres. That is 25 hours of operation. The hospital administrator is already on the radio trying to source a tanker truck. But the trucks are stuck in gridlock, or their drivers have deserted to be with their families, or the fuel depot they need to load from has no power to pump the fuel. At hour 6, the hospital begins triage not based on injury, but based on energy consumption. Incubators are turned off. The most immediate threat to urban life is not radiation, but water. Water pressure in a modern city is maintained by electric pumps. Gravity towers exist, but they are buffers holding only a few hours of supply. At hour 4, as the backup batteries in the pumping stations die, the pressure in the mains drops. In high-rise buildings, taps run dry immediately. Firefighters, fighting the secondary fires caused by the thermal pulse, hook up to hydrants and find them dead. Worse, the sewage treatment plants have stopped. Without power to process waste, raw sewage begins to back up or overflow into rivers. The same rivers that survivors will soon be looking to for drinking water. The biological clock has started. Phase C, the food clock. By hour 8, the realization of the catastrophe has set in. The supermarkets are being stripped. We must analyze the just-in-time inventory levels of 1983. A typical grocer held roughly 2 to 3 days of stock under normal buying patterns. Under panic buying, where each customer attempts to purchase 10 times their normal volume, the math dictates that the shelves are bare in less than 4 hours. The looting is not malicious, it is rational. Humans are 2,000-calorie engines. Once the visible stock is gone, the city is reliant on what is in the home pantries. In dense urban housing projects, average household reserves are estimated at less than 3 days. The city is now a food desert. The invisible tragedy of Phase C is the cold chain. Europe's protein supply, meat, dairy, frozen vegetables, sits in massive refrigerated distribution centers on the outskirts of cities. These facilities are insulated, but without power, they are warming. By hour 12, the internal temperature breaches safety limits. Millions of tons of meat and dairy begin to spoil. In a functioning society, this food would be distributed immediately. But with the trucks halted and the communications down, the warehouse managers have no way to move it and no authority to release it. We are witnessing a paradox. Mass starvation beginning mere miles away from mountains of rotting food. The caloric wealth of the nation is being destroyed by thermodynamics. Government planners will point to strategic reserves, the national grain stockpiles. Yes, they exist. But wheat in a silo is not bread on a table. Converting grain into edible calories requires 3 things: milling, baking, and distribution. Industrial mills run on electricity. Industrial bakeries run on gas or electricity. Both are offline. The artisan baker with a wood-fired oven can feed a village, but he cannot feed a metropolis of millions. The processing capacity of the food system has been decapitated. The grain sits in the silos, safe and useless, while the population begins the slide into caloric deficit. Phase D, the long night. It is the night of November 2nd. Europe is darker than it has been since the Middle Ages. The fires from the burning cities provide the only illumination. In the surviving pockets, the temperature is dropping. It is November. Heating systems rely on electric circulation pumps or gas pressure. Both are failing. The information blackout is now total. No TV, no radio, no orders. Local police forces, overwhelmed and fearing for their own families, effectively disband or retreat to secure their own precincts. The social contract, the agreement that the state will protect you in exchange for order, evaporates when the state cannot transmit its voice. At hour 18, the secondary death wave begins. The blast killed millions instantly, but now the dependents begin to die. Those on dialysis, those needing insulin, which requires refrigeration, those trapped in elevators or subway tunnels. The burn victims who survived the initial flash are now succumbing to shock and sepsis in hospitals that have gone dark and cold. The diesel generators are sputtering out. The water in the header tanks is gone. The sanitation systems are backing up. The city, as an organism, has suffered multiple organ failure. The survivors are now inhabitants of a landscape that is actively hostile to human life, not due to radiation, but due to the absence of the industrial inputs required to sustain high-density populations. As the 24-hour mark approaches, the final variable enters the equation: fallout. The ground bursts used against hardened targets like missile silos and command bunkers have kicked up millions of tons of radioactive soil. The wind patterns of November 1983 pushed these plumes across the map. Areas that survived the blast and the blackout, rural villages, untouched suburbs, are now being blanketed in lethal particulate matter. The survivors face a grim choice: evacuate into a gridlocked, starving, chaotic void, or stay put and absorb a lethal dose. The logic of civil defence effectively collapses here. There is nowhere to go, and nothing to eat if you get there. Fast forward. The immediate war ends, but the siege does not. The 1983 scenario does not result in human extinction, but it results in extinction of the industrial era. The grid takes a decade to rebuild, not weeks. Without the grid, there is no fertiliser production, which requires vast energy. Without fertiliser, crop yields drop by 50%. The population of Europe effectively corrects downwards to meet the carrying capacity of pre-industrial agriculture. We are looking at a famine that claims more lives than the warheads. The complexities of the Eurodollar, the common market, and the transatlantic alliance are replaced by the simple, brutal arithmetic of calories per acre. We study 1983 not for nostalgia, but for warning. Today, our grid is smarter, but more fragile. We have traded analogue switches for digital SCADA systems connected to the internet. We have traded national stockpiles for hyper-efficient global supply chains. The EHV transformers that were the bottleneck in 1983? They are still the bottleneck today, only now they are built in China and have a lead time of 18 months. We have optimized our civilization for profit, assuming that the peace will hold forever. But the physics of the grid and the biology of the food system have not changed. We are still 9 meals away from anarchy. The logic that stopped nuclear war in 1983 was the fear of this exact simulation. But today, new players are looking at the board. The math of a blockade around Taiwan or a cyber attack on the US power grid follows the exact same logistical curves we just analysed. The weapons change, but the fragility of the system remains. If you want to understand not just history, but the mechanics of the future, you need to look at the spreadsheets, not the speeches. Join us in the War Room. Subscribe to Counterfactual Curriculum, because the only way to prevent the collapse is to understand exactly how it happens.